When I first started playing home video games, I gravitated almost exclusively towards arcade ports and arcade-style games. Lots of shoot-em-ups, run-and guns, things of that nature. But as time went on, I became acutely aware that a game could be great no matter the genre or subject matter. When Capcom released DuckTales in 1989, I was also taught a fine lesson in not brushing off an IP in gaming just because you didn't care for it elsewhere. I had no great love for Disney characters. Hell, growing up, I was all about Voltron, Defender of the Universe, and the many adventures of Optimus Prime and the Transformers. But that game was so much more than I ever would have given it credit for otherwise. When Sega launched its Genesis, they mainly pimped the sports and arcade games, so I of course was all in for that campaign. I always tried to give any game a real chance though, so when Sega released Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, you can imagine my shock when a good friend began singing its praises. I was skeptical, but when I finally got my hands on it, wow, what a surprise! I genuinely fell in love with it and found it quite the solid platformer. In this episode, we will take a look at the 16-bit version of Castle of Illusion and break down why it's such a great game. Castle of Illusion originally was released at the very end of 1990 in both Japan and North America, with other regions getting it in early 1991. It was developed internally at Sega R&D 2, which was later rebadged as Sega CS and responsible for a ton of the most popular games across the SG-1000, Master System, and Genesis. The main game designer was Emiko Yamamoto, who was also part of nearly every decent Disney game Sega made back then, including the 8-bit Castle of Illusion, Quackshot, World of Illusion, Land of Illusion, and Deep Duck Trouble. The story starts out like most tales of this nature. A couple of happy people are minding their own business when some miserable spoiler of fun has to make sure to ruin it for everybody. The evil witch Mizrabel has kidnapped Minnie, and Mickey must conquer the Castle of Illusion to get her back. It's gonna be no easy task, however, because you must first collect the 7 gems of the rainbow in order to unlock the final path. The gameplay is straight-up action platforming, nothing difficult to explain or come to terms with after only a few moments of playing. Mickey can jump and use his butt bounce to kill enemies, or throw apples at them from a distance. Apples are collected like ammunition during the stages you play, and there are plenty of things scattered about for target practice. There are 5 main stages which then have sub-levels before you make it to a boss character. Like the regular enemies, you must jump on or throw apples at them to gain victory. There is typically a theme to each stage. In the first, you'll make your way across the Enchanted Forest. In the second, Toyland, so on and so forth. While initially it looks like it would play exactly like Super Mario, it actually plays a bit differently. Instead of just jumping on an enemy to defeat it, you actually must jump and then hit the jump again to activate the butt bounce, so timing becomes quite important. Aside from taking out enemies, it can also give you a much needed boost to get to higher platforms, or get you across longer jumps. As you defeat each area, you'll collect a new gem and move on to a different room in the castle. Once you collect all the gems, a path opens up to your final confrontation. For a 4 megabit cartridge, Castle of Illusion here is just gorgeous. Aside from the appealing art of the IP itself, the color and animation do early 16-bit games quite proud. There is a great variety in the locations and enemies you face, again impressive for such a small cartridge. When my friend lent this game to me and I dropped it into my Genesis, I was blown away. I mean, the Genesis had been impressing me already with stuff like Revenge of Shinobi and eSWAT, but Castle of Illusion was out of left field with its lush environments and whimsical enemies. It's not overly cartoonish either, which I quite liked. There is a tone of gritty realism to the art, and it's enhanced by the color palette the developers chose. It really was a great match, and the end result was one of 1990's better looking games. While later Disney games would come along and put up some impressive visuals themselves, I still gotta give credit where credit is due. Castle of Illusion was one nice looking Genesis title. The sound and music are best described as suitable. Nothing here will blow you away or be featured in a Best Music of the Genesis episode. But what it lacks in overall execution, it certainly makes up for in feeling like it belongs here. From the enchanted forest to the castle itself, all the background music fits exactly where you hear it. Whether it's swinging on vines over bottomless pits or running from killer toys, this stuff feels right at home. Here are a few examples. There are a few areas where I feel Castle of Illusion could be better. While it certainly plays well enough, the game is overall short and easy. There are but 5 main stages, and the first 3 of those go by like they're nothing. It's stage 4 before you hit any real challenge, but it's the kind of challenge that's based on quick deaths and your memory not to repeat them. In other words, you won't fall for them but once or twice before you move on. Once you get the feel for the butt bounce and chucking apples at enemies, you become a killing machine that easily walks through this one with nary a death to stop you. Even the last boss is a cakewalk once you see the super easy patterns she works within. The side effect of this ease of difficulty is that it becomes a perfect game to play with your kids. They should be able to tackle the first few stages with no issues at all, and even some of the later stages are tolerable. When it comes to your own entertainment, there is a hard setting you can play that makes things a bit tougher. You get some new enemy placements, platforms that are a bit harder to navigate, and fewer extra lives. If you think Castle of Illusion is too easy, this will definitely give you a bit more challenge. Overall, I really do think this game is one of Sega's better releases that year. It stepped away from Sega's usual hardcore sports and arcade grind and gave us something unexpected. Don't let the IP turn you away. Underneath that Disney exterior is an excellent looking and playing platformer. The 8 and 16-bit versions of Castle of Illusion share many traits. The base story is the same. The evil Mizrabel has kidnapped Minnie, and it's up to Mickey to climb the Great Castle of Illusion and rescue her. It starts out with 3 levels that can be chosen in any order. There's the Dessert Factory with its killer chocolate chips, donuts, and gummy dolphins. There's the Enchanted Forest with its magical trees, plants, and insects. Then there's Toyland, with its remote-controlled planes, cars, and clowns. Each stage is themed with its own enemies, bosses, and backgrounds. These stages are heavily reliant on platform play, and the majority of your deaths will most likely come from falling into bottomless pits that dominate the play area. Mickey is not without the ability to defend himself, however. He has the traditional move of jumping on top of enemies to get rid of them, which actually takes an additional press of the button to attack and land with your butt. This butt bounce can be used on treasure chests and bosses as well, and it even opens up hidden items if you are in the right area. In addition to his ass, Mickey can also pick up items and throw them as weapons. But even this element of the gameplay goes well beyond the typical uses seen in other platformers of the time. Aside from throwing items at enemies, you can also pick them up and use them to help you reach greater heights with your jumps, find keys to open doors, and even carry around lanterns to light up darkened rooms. Exploration also plays a major role in the stage design. The closest thing I can liken its playstyle to is a mix of Mario 2 and DuckTales, 2 of the best games on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Often you hear that Sega Master System titles can be compared visually to early 16-bit games, and Castle of Illusion here is a damn fine looking game. The color palette of the hardware is put to good use, and you get 6 stages with an awesome variety in background and enemies. Mickey's sprite is brilliantly animated too. Just running and jumping around puts most 8-bit titles to shame, and he loses his balance on ledges and slides to a stop at a time when you mostly saw that kind of thing on the Sega Genesis. The real power of the visual presentation comes from the variety of it all. Every stage is super colorful and very different from one another. The dessert factory has ice cream and other sweets all around you, while the library has pencils, rulers, and books. Each stage has a theme and the visuals stay pretty faithful to it. Of course, there is always room for more. I would have loved to have seen some parallax scrolling here and there, and I really wish the larger enemies were as well animated as Mickey himself. These are purely nitpicks though, as the title looks exceptional for a 2 megabit cart. There are games twice this size on the Mega Drive that don't look much better. Sound and music is an area where the Sega Master System has its fans, and has those of you that can't stand it. To me, the sound here is absolutely iconic. Castle of Illusion was one of the very first games I got with my Japanese Game Gear, so I associate just about everything about it with that time. This music played along while I was loving that color backlit screen. I played it many a late night in my room, headphones on, not a care at all that school was only hours away. This soundtrack played away while I showed it off to my family and friends, proud of my Sega handheld that had such a great library that early on. Before the Game Gear Shinobi showed up, this was the showpiece, and indeed this music was a big part of that. Of course, if you hated Sega Master System PSG, this will do nothing to change your mind. It's high-pitched and can grate if you turn the volume up too much. I loved it though, and it's just as endearing as the visuals and its excellent gameplay. By the time Castle of Illusion showed up in North America, the Sega Master System was long dead. The Genesis was well on its way to the Sonic era, and the Game Gear was just starting out. That's where I played it first, and that's where I fell in love with it. It had the gameplay mechanics and presentation that borrowed the best from the platformers before it, and put it behind an instantly likable and recognizable license. The best part of this was Sega's insistence on doing 2 completely different games for its systems. I mean, they easily could have just scaled back the Genesis version and spit out a Me Too game that was simply a lesser clone. They didn't do that here, instead giving us completely different levels, new gameplay mechanics, and an adventure well worth taking all on its own. I always found that Sega was best when they did it this way. When Sega tried to simply downgrade a superior version, we ended up with stuff that often looked and played worse. But when Sega went with something that took advantage of the Sega Master System, we got something truly worth playing. That was the Sega I loved best, and a big reason why this game turned out as well as it did. Whether you are a fan of Mario, Sonic, or other great action platformers, Castle of Illusion stands on its own as a worthy addition to your library. There are some folks out there that will tell you Castle of Illusion is overrated, that it simply isn't as good as Sega fans make it out to be. I disagree. I think this one was quite a big step for Sega as a developer. They took someone else's property, built a solid playing game around it, and set up what would become an excellent franchise of games. You really do have to put 1990 into perspective. Sega was growing a new brand and they needed software. They released sports games, arcade ports, and gritty action titles that they had been known for. Castle of Illusion was a breath of fresh air within that group of usual suspects. It was a welcome addition and one I'll always fondly remember. The Mega Drive version was so well received in Japan, Sega released it in a Sega Ages pack for the Sega Saturn. It was paired with Quackshot and is one of the few Saturn Sega Ages releases to be based on console games. In 2013, Sega and Disney decided to remake Castle of Illusion for a bunch of devices. Using 3D polygonal graphics, it touched up existing stage design and added a bunch new areas and enemies to the mix. You can still get it for the Xbox One and Xbox Series X through backwards compatibility. The 1990 Genesis game will always have a special place in my heart. Not only was it part of my early days with the platform, but it was also further proof that judging a game by its cover simply wasn't good enough. Every game deserved a chance, and if you are a fan of Sega's 4th generation entry, this one is something you just gotta play. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.